Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the EU-UK Forum, which is a constructive, non-partisan forum that was set up to try and foster good and better EU-UK relations after Brexit. And given the state of play 6 or 7 weeks in, I suspect there's going to be plenty more of these events and plenty more work to be done. To discuss the future of EU-UK relations, there is probably no one better placed from the UK side anyway than Sir Ivan Rogers, who joins me. Sir Ivan really has worked on all sides of this. He was the chef de cabinet for Leon Britton when Brits really did have influence in Brussels. David Cameron's Europe advisor during the renegotiation, the failed renegotiations, it turned out. Not that that was Ivan's fault. And was Perm Rep when we had Perm Reps in Brussels. Ivan, you really have, let's say, seen it from both sides. We're 6 weeks into the relationship. And I think there were kind of two broad conceptions of the relationship. One, perhaps I might attribute to Charles Grant, who runs the Centre for European Reform, who sees that fundamentally the EU and the UK are on the same page on climate, on the Middle East, on trade, actually, although notwithstanding some of the stuff we've seen recently on China, but fundamentally are in the same place. And if the UK wants to do well as global Britain in a G7, G20 format, it's going to have to make the EU relationship work. And then perhaps the alternative view, which is that this relationship is fundamentally frictional. Jonathan Hill telling the FT this week, that if you look at the way Switzerland operates, the contact points in the relationship just constantly produce elements of leverage which the EU can't help but use. And I wondered, as we stand now, which path do you think we're on? Are we stuck on that path, and can we shape a different kind of relationship?
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Peter, for introducing me, and thanks to Paul for inviting and also setting up this forum, which, as you say, I think is an extremely welcome idea. We're going to need a lot of people outside the official channels to try and make this relationship prosper over the years ahead. It's a very good question, Peter. It's probably too early to judge. There may be both a kind of short, medium-term view on this and the longer-term view. I think I'm probably more of a longer-term optimist and a short, medium-term pessimist or realist, if I can put it like that. I think there will be gravitational effects over the years and maybe decades ahead, which force us back into a rather closer relationship, both economically and geostrategically, with our European friends and partners than we will have right now. But I don't see that really happening under this government, in all honesty. And I don't think there's an appetite from the UK side to have it. I don't think there's an appetite from the EU side to have it. So I hope that doesn't sound too gloomy in the short term. It seems to me I'm more in the Hill camp than the Grant camp, if you could put it like that, in the short and medium term. I don't think we are where we are on the deal. The deal is better than no deal, but it's a relatively skinny free trade agreement. I don't even find that surprising. I think the first thing I said when I got summoned to various select committees after I resigned was that, given the referendum campaign and what had come out of it, and given where the government stood, I didn't see that anything deeper or closer than a free trade agreement could be the substance of the economic agreement. I think I said very early on in February 2017 that I thought the best aspiration, therefore, given that we were going to leave both the single market and the customs union, would be the most comprehensive free trade agreement on the planet. That's not where we've ended up. It's not to say it's a terrible free trade agreement. There are good elements in it and there's serious elements in it, but it's much thinner than that. It's much thinner than that because that's what the UK government wanted. And it wanted a non-bespoke, bog standard free trade agreement. So when I look at where we are, even this week and what's happened over the last 6 weeks, do I sense an enormous appetite on the part of the Johnson government to have a thick and close and warm relationship with the EU as EU? No, I don't. I don't. That's not where he was when he was Foreign Secretary and when I was working for him. It's not where he's been as Prime Minister. It's not what David Frost tried to negotiate last year. It's not where they've ended up at the end of last year. So I don't think we should be under any illusions that it's going to be a bit spiky, maybe more than a bit spiky. It's going to be pretty bumpy. There are going to be quite a lot of disputes and conflicts to try and resolve, and we'll see whether the Partnership Council can cope with that and whether the dispute resolution mechanisms can cope with that.
You mentioned David Frost, who, of course, actually not only negotiated the agreement, but also I think very much was part of the camp that wanted to prioritise the repatriation of sovereignty over market access. And of course, as we discovered yesterday, David Frost will be Maroš Šefčovič's opposite number on that Partnership Council. All the way through this process, I think it's fair to say David Frost has taken quite a confrontational approach. He took the view that the Europeans could be forced into a technological trade border in Ireland. He took a pretty tough view. I think it's fair to say he probably backed the Boris Johnson stance on threatening to rewrite the Irish Protocol, the Independent Market Bill, Internal Market Bill rather. So how should we read his appointment? A lot of rune reading going on in Whitehall at the moment. How should we read the fact that Boris Johnson's chosen David Frost as his point man on post-Brexit relations?
Well, I personally don't think it's terribly surprising, and I'm always worried about trying to read the runes and do the criminology from the outside. It's bad enough trying to do it from the inside, in my recollection. But I don't think it's terribly surprising. I think they view it primarily as a process of implementing this deal. There is some recognition, although they won't quite put it like that, that this is an ongoing and indeed permanent negotiation, which is, after all, what some of us were saying in 2016. We aren't at the end, we're at the beginning of a new chapter, but there's plenty still to do. There is a formidable implementation process through the course of this year. And I think that's sending a signal to the European side that that's where the focus is. This is not about, let's turn the page and it's a brave new world and a new chapter, and various new things might be negotiated straight away in 2021 to amplify what we all agreed at the end of last year. I just don't think that's the mood in Whitehall and Westminster or at the top of the government. So I think that's how to read it. I don't think it's surprising. And David, after all, having negotiated the agreement, knows it better than anybody. So it's not too surprising that he's the man in situ for a while.
You advise industry, Ivan, and you advise people across business. What should they take away from it? I mean, we've seen in the first 6 weeks of this deal a lot of industries sort of waking up to the fact that they can no longer do hub distribution out of the UK because of rules of origin preventing them importing stuff and then sending it back into the EU without attracting tariffs. A lot of worry about the lack of a mobility chapter. Nothing in there to allow musicians and rock stars, but also all the other people who do services trade to go into the EU. But also a lot of sort of demands for fixes from various industries. So what should they read into the Frost appointment?
Well, I think what I get a lot from lots of different people I talk to in lots of different sectors and industries still surprises me, really. After 4.5 years, I have obviously been out there, on a pretty regular basis, as you will testify, and pretty publicly with my view about where it could end and why it would end there, and whether we might even end up with no deal, but at best we would end up with a skinny FTA. I think what's fascinating to watch when you're dealing with the captains of industry and with many business federations, frankly, is that it does take a long while to sink in. And although intellectually many of them say they bought that proposition and recognised where things were going, there is still, as you say, and we're seeing it surface all over the place now, an expectation of, oh, well, they can't really have wanted that, and they can't really have realised that this was the true implication for our sector. So if we go and lobby them now and demonstrate to them what's happening on the ground as a consequence of the deal they've negotiated, they must want to rejig it, refine it, and reopen the negotiation in 2021. I suppose in shorthand, my advice is, don't believe it, guys. We are where we are. There isn't a new negotiation to be had. There's no appetite on either side of the table to reopen it. I don't think that's where David Frost or his boss will be or will want to be. I think you should get on with life and face the shock. I think it's a mistake on the part of the government, frankly, to carry on. I've regularly made the criticism of both the May government and the Johnson government over recent years, so this is nothing new, of not really being straight with the public about what the implications of the choice were. As I say, I thought from day one, if not before day one, that if we left, we would leave the single market and the customs union. That's quite a major supply shock to the UK economy. It's a major economic regime change of the sort that we haven't been through in at least half a century. It carries various completely ineluctable consequences, and they are ineluctable. You can then go around sort of claiming victimisation and the EU is being vindictive and imperial in its behaviour. But if you want a bog standard FTA and you want Canada dry, oddly enough, that's what you end up with, and then you're going to be treated like other third countries. And that's not always a very pleasant experience. But I suppose my point to you is you're still seeing a lot and hearing a lot of corporate executives who only now are registering the fact that we've ended up in something which gives them a much more complex world to deal with and may well break apart various business models. And they still think that if they just go and lobby government now, there's something that could be done via the Joint Partnership Council to sort of amend where we ended up and rectify the problem. And my honest answer is I really don't think that's where we are, and I don't think it's going to happen.
So do you, because it has been a sort of strange discombobulating world where the government on one hand championed its Canada-only FTA. Boris Johnson was, humming Waltzing Matilda. He was happy to go Australian, throw another prawn on the barbie. And yet when the deal came back, there's been absolutely none of the embracing. I mean, there's been no one going out saying, well, we've wanted a bog standard trade deal. We've got one. Yeah, it doesn't mean you can't really do services anything like as easily. And no, you're not going to get your mollusks into the EU. There's been no real embracing of the deal. And I wonder, which then begs the question, how long before the government needs to start shaping and delivering the upsides? And we're starting to get some questions coming in. And if you all look at I think the bottom right of your screen, you can type in questions. And there's one here from Anthony Manchester at BlackRock. And he says, is Andrew Bailey right to insist, and this is to my point about where the upsides are, that the UK should not be rule takers in financial services, for example? It's a big world out there. You remember, obviously, the EU trying to take back euro clearing in 2015. You probably fought that rear guard yourself, did you? But
yeah.
Is there an upside? And does the fact that they've done this very bare bones deal actually prick them into being more adventurous on the regulatory side than industry wants, and that perhaps some people expected?
Well, I think it's very difficult to generalise across sectors. So, if you're talking about, fish or road haulage or aviation or chemicals, it's different from financial services. And, there's, having worked in the city for several years, there's also no such beast as the city, and they're very divergent interests in various different chunks of the city. I've never thought that we could or should end up as a rule taker outside the European Union, which is one of the reasons why I was trying to counsel people both inside government and outside that a Norwegian type model was not viable for the UK economy. Because, for the Norwegians, with all respect to them, and it's a hugely wonderful and prosperous country, it's also a country with a heavily oversubsidised agriculture and fisheries and a massive single commodity and a sovereign wealth fund. It's not a country with a massive wholesale financial services industry. So would it have been palatable for the UK to end up effectively having its financial regulation set by French and Germans and others in the Council and in the European Parliament? No, of course not. So it's not to say that there aren't variants of an EEA type model that you could have worked on, but we could never end up there. The Bank of England and the Treasury, and I'm from the Treasury, would never have agreed it. It was never a viable option. And it's amazing that politicians on both sides of the political divide didn't really understand that that was not a viable model. So I'm with Andrew on the kind of rule taking and that issue, and the non-viability of a Norwegian type model, and the need on financial stability grounds, amongst other things, to have our own sort of rule making. Where I diverge, I think, from what Andrew said, I don't really agree with his phrasing of that last week, is I think we are subject to a bog standard, completely normal equivalence process. And I think Jonathan Hill, who used to run the equivalence process when he was in the financial services job in the Commission until 4 or 5 years ago, would say so, because he took equivalence decisions on behalf of the European Union. Now, I said openly, again, in early 2017, when first interrogated on my reasons for departure, that I see plenty wrong with the equivalence regime. I've negotiated plenty of them and been in plenty of ECOFINs over the years on equivalence decisions and arguments. I do think it's capricious. I do think it's excessively politicized. I do think being able to withdraw these things at 30 days notice is not desired. I mean, there are lots of problems with the equivalence regimes and it's patchy. I mean, there are lots of problems and I tried to articulate those 4 or 5 years ago. The problem I have with what Andrew said is we know all that. We were there in the room. We negotiated it. John Cunliffe and I spent much of our lives negotiating it. We know exactly how equivalence operates. We know exactly what the European Union is going to do. So this idea that we're sort of uniquely victimised in the way they're approaching the equivalence decision on the UK, no, it's a function of the fact that we are diverging. And you know, Peter, I've said this before, where they're dealing with a stable, coherent regulatory regime and they can look at it and know it's stable on the part of the third country, then you can take those decisions. They're laborious and cumbersome and, as I say, politicised, and there's lots about the regime I don't like. But where you're dealing with a country where you don't know where they're going and they won't divulge where they're going, and it's not clear whether their regime is stable or whether they are indeed deliberately going to diverge in certain respects, or whether they're going to advance the argument that they can deliver equivalent outcomes via radically different routes, then there is going to be more hesitancy on the European side of the table. That's nothing UK unique or specific. The same applies on data adequacy, very similar sort of process. Looks like we are going to get a sort of green light on data adequacy, although I think that will be subject to challenge in the European Court of Justice pretty soon, and the European Parliament may take a different view. But I think it's also similar to the problems we've had over sanitary and phytosanitary provision, without making too many analogies across. You know, there David Frost did not want to do what the Swiss have done and guarantee ongoing alignment in perpetuity with the EU SPS regime in order to maximise market access. Well, you must take the rough with the smooth. He doesn't want to do that, presumably, because he wants to be able to join CPTPP or he wants to do a US deal, and the US is going to insist on us changing our rules. But
so is it?
The problem is the absence of clarity and stability. The point I've frequently made, which is where we are on day one is irrelevant. Everybody knows we're convergent on day one because by definition we're operating the rule book that we used to operate on day zero. But where do we want to be on day 2 or day 200 or day 2000? Unless we can clarify where that is, then there are going to be problems with the European Union on these processes, which they have complete autonomy in. You know, equivalence and adequacy are two of those. Those are decisions at 27. They're not negotiated decisions with the UK.
So do you see strategy and clarity emerging? Because to your point, I mean, SBS is a good example. Are we not going to do a trade deal with the United States? That will impact the way in which we run, the way in which we have our own SPS regulations and the way they interact with the EU. Similarly with the city, do you see, I mean, Ian Duncan Smith is having his review, isn't he? And he's promised he don't want a bonfire of regulation. And there's sort of vague talk about fintech and green tech and a wider engagement with Asian markets. But do you see, to your point about the sort of the stasis that blocks, in some ways, the interactions with the EU, do you see clarity emerging from this government? I mean, they've done this thing now. They've really cut the apron strings.
Not as yet. It doesn't surprise me that there isn't clarity. I mean, they wanted the capability to diverge. That's the sovereignty argument, without necessarily knowing in great detail or even in very limited detail exactly how they wanted to diverge. So in fairness to them, it's about the capability and the sovereign ability to diverge. That, of course, is very difficult to write into a trade agreement, which is why we've ended up with the sort of trade agreement we have. Because, as I say, this is an unprecedented trade agreement between two partners seeking to get further apart. Nearly all trade deals, every trade deal I've ever dealt with is between partners who want to get closer together. And when you're dealing with services or outside the tariffs area on goods, what is that about? It's about a process of regulatory convergence and about building trust and mutual recognition. By definition, that's more difficult when the two partners are seeking to get further apart, or at least the one partner that deliberately left the club. Why did you leave the club unless you wanted to diverge? It's then a legitimate question for the EU to ask the UK to say, well, exactly how far do you want to diverge and on what? Now, it doesn't surprise me. These things take many more years than people expected, which is why I said what I said in 2016. The fact that the government hasn't yet, even now, thought very deeply about where it wants to diverge and how, and the extent to which it does, it's going to have to think in legislative terms, what are its priorities? Where does it think the biggest advantages from divergence come? In which sectors? And then it's going to have to judge, without sounding too much like a sort of economist, the reaction function of the European Union to that degree of divergence. In other words, where's the European Union going to hit it? And when it comes to a dispute resolution, does the UK feel confident it's going to win this because the divergence is acceptable and not materially damaging to trade or the integrity of the single market? Or does it feel the EU is going to try and hit it hard between the eyes? So that process is going to get underway in 2021, I assume across multiple sectors in Whitehall. I would have thought that most departments are going to look for those areas where they might want to regulate and legislate differently. We'll see what Ian Duncan Smith and co come up with. I've never thought that this government is fundamentally a very deregulatory and Thatcherite government. So this fear in the EU that, we're going to be Singapore on Thames and bonfire of the regulations and race to the bottom, I think is overdone in Brussels and Strasbourg, but it's undoubtedly there. I don't think that's Johnson, really. But if you press Johnson, I only had very limited opportunities to okay, I get that you want the capability and the option to diverge and do your own thing and do it in potentially radically different ways. Where and on what? You didn't get much of a reply in 2016, and we haven't seen much of a reply so far by the beginning of 2021, nearly 5 years later.
But Ivan, I mean, you end up with all pain and no gain at that point. And so, we have 48%, I think, 2018 figures of UK total trade with the EU. Do you end up in a world where, I know, the Brexiteers have often sort of wanted to defy gravity, but do you end up in a world where actually gravity does take over? I've got Malcolm Harbour here from the European Policy Centre, who makes the point that actually, David Frost was head of the EU Single Market Unit in Bays, and I think actually he authored the balance of competences review on the single market, if I'm correct. And Malcolm says that he worked with him when he was a chair of the Internal Market Committee at the European Parliament, and he wonders whether there is some hope that actually Frost might use that experience to kind of make some of the technical changes that at the start of this conversation you said were doubtful. That actually, when COVID lifts and we really start to see what it means, particularly on mobility, I think that there will be some movement, or are you going to stick to your guns on that one?
I suspect there won't be. I mean, in fairness to David, we've all written government documents we don't necessarily agree with every word of, and I shouldn't think for a moment that he agreed with every word of what he produced or was obliged to produce on the balance of competences review. So I'm not going to speak for him on that, and it would be wholly inappropriate to try to. He's much more sceptical about the benefits of the single market in general than I would be. As I say, we are where we are, and I accepted on day one that I thought, given the complexion of the government and the Vote Leave campaign, and given that we wanted to end free movement of people and we couldn't be a rule taker, we were bound to leave the single market. And given what the government also thought about the role of the European Court of Justice. What puzzles me about modern Conservatives in comparison with the Conservatives I worked for back, you mentioned my Leon Britton days, and back to the days of Lord Cockfield in the 1980s, is why were the Conservatives, above all, enthusiasts for a single market in the 1980s and early 1990s? Enthusiasts for enlargement and free movement of people as well, incidentally. I'm old enough to remember when Conservatives believed in all these things. Why did they believe in them? Because they thought a free trade area alone was not enough and not deep enough. And they thought the most pernicious barriers to trade liberalisation were non-tariff barriers. And that unless you tackled the non-tariff barriers, which were often the most vigorously protectionist in national jurisdictions, we could never create a home market in the whole of the European Union. Thatcher vehemently believed that. I heard her say it, and I heard people like David Williamson, who subsequently became Secretary General of the Commission when I was working in the Commission, prosecuting that in the 1980s. But the Tories of the late 80s and early 90s and the enthusiasts for the single market would never have made the kind of statements that Vote Leave, the Michael Goves, the Boris Johnsons made in 2016 of, we'll still be part of a free trade area from Iceland to Turkey, because there's no such thing. and they would never have made a sort of, never have made the sort of vacuous remarks about supposed similarity between a thin free trade agreement, which is what we've ended up with as a single market. Now, David and I would undoubtedly take different views about the success or otherwise of the single market. It's not that I think the single market in either goods or services is either complete or perfect, or has produced the dividends for the European economy that I believe it could have done. So there might well be common ground between him and me. I've made that argument repeatedly inside, Coreper and many councils over many years about the need to deepen the services single market and make it much more effective. My problem with where he ends up, and I, just been debating this with people like Gerard Lyons in the last 24 hours, is yes, it's true that we still have an incomplete single market in services. There's still a hell of a lot to be done. There are still protectionist barriers, despite the existence of a single market. There's plenty that we got wrong. All of that is true, and nevertheless, the deepest services cross-border liberalisation anywhere on the planet is in the European Union. We chose to leave that because we don't like the juridical and political implications of deep integration. So we don't like deep liberalisation. We want much less deep liberalisation, which means a free trade area. Fine. But then you're saying we want in free trade deals with, CPTPP or the Americans or, the Japanese or the Brazilians, presumably we're largely a services-based economy. Again, a very Thatcherite evolution in our economy, deliberately to become a very services-orientated, competitive services economy. How much progress are we going to be able to make via free trade deals beyond what we got from EU free trade deals with those partners in services? And my answer again, I'm afraid, would be much more equivocal or much more modest. Good luck negotiating a free trade deal with India. India hasn't had a free trade deal with any developed country in the world since its foundation in 1947. Good luck getting further trade liberalisation with Japan. I've negotiated with the Japanese and I love them dearly, but it's not the most open market. Okay, you may get some useful incremental things from joining CPTPP. I would have to look at that much more closely and understand it much more closely. But don't kid yourselves that you're going to get swathes of, performance enhancing services liberalisation via FTAs, multiple FTAs that DIT concludes over the next 5 to 10 years, because it ain't going to happen. Which is not to be defeatist. I'm all in for it. I'm a free trader. I'm a treasury guy. I'm a multilateral free trader, a plurilateral free trader, all these things. I'm in favour of doing multiple different deals and trying to make Britain a sort of competitive hub outside the European Union. That's all fine. I just don't kid myself that it's going to add up to a massive hill of beans in terms of UK competitiveness.
No, indeed. And as a former foreign correspondent who spent a decade in China and India, our EU membership was not what stopped us trading over there. It's actually harder to trade services into those economies than it is to trade goods, as the Germans do.
Which is one reason why the German economy is, has done enormously much better than the UK economy vis-a-vis China. I mean, EU trade flows with China have just exceeded EU trade flows with the US for the first time in history. This doesn't suggest to me that Europe is not global Europe. But it also doesn't suggest to me that Europe, by dint of having done much more trade with China and often been much more successful with China than the UK has been, that it's grown very fast as a consequence. So I just don't buy the rather facile arguments that are coming out of DIT or Liz Truss or Gerard or other. I mean, fine, of course we want to be better connected and liberalising more deeply with the fastest growing economies on earth. We can all sort of speak the sound bites. What does it really amount to? What are you going to do? Which deals are you going to be able to do? What are you going to put on the table in order to get those deals, which have not been possible for other partners around the globe, including the Americans, to get with them?
No, which in some ways, we bet the house on a chimera there, I fear, and bringing ourselves back to the neighbourhood where we live, to the European Union. David Liddington has a question, which is an interesting one. He was, of course, Europe Minister when Brexit happened. I remember it well. Now chair of the Royal United Services Institute. And David says, what's your assessment of where the EU 27, not Brussels, not the management of the TCA, but where does the 27 want the UK relationship to end up? And can you explore, the differences between member states? Because all through the process, the Brits have tried to negotiate bilaterally, and now, of course, they're going to have bilateral relations with the EU, which will be in tension with the member states' relations with the Commission. So, how do you see, on a sort of 10-year horizon, David asks, how do you see those relationships unfolding?
Yeah, well, I think that's right, that the UK did try repeatedly, mostly completely unsuccessfully, to sort of go to individual member states and see whether there were ways around what they regarded as the theologians and the apparatchiks in both the Commission and the Council. It signally failed, partly because of the methodology that Barnier adopted in constantly going round the leaders and knowing that he had a kind of secure base and knowing his position. So I don't think it was particularly good diplomacy on the British part in the last 4 or 5 years, in all honesty. They will emphasise much more strongly, including on foreign and external policy, as David knows, the relationship with France and with Germany bilaterally, above all with France, I think, and not do much with the External Action Service. And, he knows better than I do the habitual Foreign Office views of CFSP. I think it's been a European failure, and I've said so before, on what do they want of the relationship with Britain as a third country. Now, I don't think this is a strength of the European Union in thinking deeply and collectively about its relationship with key third countries. I was obviously there for debates that leaders had over Russia, over Ukraine, over China. It doesn't seem to me that ever much of the debate broke out on the British question. And they ran it as a very successful technocratic process delivered by Barnier, from which the leaders kept themselves very sensibly and consistent with the treaties and all that at one remove. Well, it's sensible up to a point. And then you say, and their style in the last 4 years through both the withdrawal negotiations and the TCA negotiations is, well, where we end up with is entirely a function of your level of ambition. Now, that's a good game. It worked very well. They've ended up with a TCA which is much more in their interest, in my view, than in the UK's interest. It's a clever negotiating strategy. It constantly put the Brits on the back foot through both the May and the Johnson administrations. The difficulty is, did the EU ever ask itself seriously at strategic level the question of, what are we going to do with the British relationship? Where do we want to end up? How is this going to work? What are we going to have to do which is very different from a relationship with Canada or Japan or indeed the US, let alone the kind of Ukraine or the Maghreb? What can we construct which with the Brits will work and give us the kind of relationship in which we want depth? And in all honesty, do I think that conversation ever really broke out at the European Council in the last 4.5 years? No. Do I think it's about to break out? No, because everybody's deeply fed up with the British question. They've got multiple other things which are more important to them. Maybe at some point, but again, this may be not under the von der Leyen Commission and maybe not under a Johnson administration, there can be more of a collective, serious discussion at leader level of where are we really with the Brits? They're not going to rejoin. I don't think we will rejoin in the foreseeable future, maybe not ever. This is a permanent thing. It's bumpy. I think we're all going to find, as I said at the beginning, that this is bumpy, spiky, quite conflictual, more competitive than harmonious. Although we all say we want healthy competition and it'll be phrased in amiable enough terms, I don't think it'll be very amiable. Is there going to be at some process on the European side of the table, a process of internal reflection of how did we end up here? Is this the right place to have ended up? These are our closest allies in this hemisphere. They're a major, an important, not just trading partner, but strategic and intelligence and military and foreign policy partner. How do we do this better? The trouble is, Peter, I have to say, after the poison of the last several years, I just don't see a huge amount of appetite to think afresh about the British question right now. This is the great value of forums like these, I hope, which is that sensible people can keep on discussing from outside. We can generate some new ideas, some fresh thinking, which is not associated with the old guard on either side. And, hopefully over time, as people maturely reflect on where we've ended up, we start to put a bit more, oomph into the relationship and a bit more substance into it and a bit more thinking, really.
It's a good question, isn't it? What is the forum for that? So the French have always shown a willingness, haven't they, to silo The trade relationship and the security relationship. Philip Hammond did a long interview with the UK, the Changing Europe think tank, as part of their sort of oral history of Brexit, and he said, actually, we underestimated the French. We missed the French. There's a lot of talk, including from yourself, wasn't there, about how Cameron and May and Johnson misunderstood Angela Merkel's power and misread the Germans. But did we misread the French? And is the kind of E3, or is there a forum there by which we can start to rebuild security relationships? And actually related, there's a question from Adam Isaacs, who's head of the unit European Parliament, which talks about whether you need two to tango. And he asks, actually, are the actions of the current government actually a deliberate strategy to delegitimize the EU as an international actor? He refers, of course, to us not giving full recognition to the EU ambassador to London. Is the D10 conceived as part of a way to give the EU no rule, unlike in the G7? I mean, are we, global Britain, trying to delegitimize the EU? And if that is the plan, what does that mean for our bilateral relationships, insofar as we can establish them, in order to try and rebuild some of those relationships that, as you say, have been clearly a casualty of the Brexit process, the need for the 27 to negotiate in a kind of highest common denominator way, in a way?
Well, it's a very difficult set of questions. Look, I think delegitimizing might be going a bit far, but the government, this government, Johnson government, and I think this would apply to David Frost and other key players in it as well, are very much happier dealing with sovereign state actors than they are with dealing with complex, whatever this non-federal, quasi-federal organizations like the EU. And they are conspicuously much more comfortable in dealing state to state. So there will be a big emphasis, I think, on building bilateral relationships, above all with the bigger states, obviously, and I think E3 formats. D10 is an interesting idea, which is also circulating, obviously, in US circles, and very understandably, having chaired the G7 process myself, I've seen both the upsides and the downsides of G7. I can see what Johnson might want to do there, bringing in kind of Indians and Australians and Koreans. I think that will immediately create problems with Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the very best of luck to them in managing that. The G7 itself, as we all know, is a very, very useful forum for fireside chats between key developed country leaders, which also includes the EU institutions, but it has no real legitimacy, which is why Paul Martin and co. Advocated the development of the G20 early on in the century. The G20 was a very valuable actor and a crucial actor in the financial crisis under the chairmanship of Gordon Brown, and I think had its zenith, frankly, under Brown dealing with the financial crisis. You'd have to say, and this may be a function of the presidency that we've had in 2020, it's been pretty invisible in this crisis. And the difficulty is, if you need a global forum to act on things, and I think you do on something like a pandemic, then I don't think it can be done just by, G7, D10 coalitions of the willing. And I don't think you can or should believe that you can run these things and kind of eliminate the Chinese and others from them. So you have to think very carefully about what the purpose of a D10 would be and what you're trying to do with it, and in the kind of new geopolitics. So delegitimization goes a bit far, but the emphasis you repeatedly get from everybody in Whitehall, whether they privately believe it or not, is we don't really want to deal with EU institutions and EU actors. Now, personally, I think even on external relations and foreign policy, it's a mistake, sanctions policy and whatever. I think, and I know people like David McAllister in the European Parliament will think it's a mistake, but they think it was a British choice, and they can't tell the Brits that they made the wrong choice. It doesn't surprise me that the Brits took the view they did, as I say, of the External Action Service and of. We've always taken a different view. We did when within. Can you imagine that somebody like my old Sherpa opposite number in Germany, Nicholas Meyer-Landrut, who was first of all the kind of Sherpa and an enormously powerful Sherpa in the European Union, and then Germany's ambassador to France, which is their most important bilateral post. What's his next posting? The EU ambassador in Turkey. Can you imagine that in the UK system? Can you imagine a senior Mandarin in the UK system in the days that we were in the European Union concluding that one of his best career paths would be to be the EU's head of mission in Ankara? And that's the difference between it. Now, we're in a different world now, as I say, but we would never have been in that world in the Foreign Office that I was dealing with 20 years ago We never took that approach to the European Union from within. Now, I think we will try and bilateralise. The difficulty they will find, and this will happen when dealing with, Swedes and Dutch and Eastern Europeans, is that quite a lot of the smaller and medium-sized countries in particular, they have essentially Europeanized this activity. So just saying, well, we'll have warm and friendly and serious bilateral relations with the Dutch, for example, on this subject, well, what does it mean, really? Because nearly all the kind of decision-making and the decision-makers have been Europeanized, and they have a European policy-making process. So the belief that you could sort of undercut that and find ways in bilaterally to have a different conversation than you would have via EU fora is going to prove to be radically mistaken, I think.
So Ivan, we're injuncted to be constructive here. Sure. I mean, you've set out the constraints to what's achievable. Julian King, the former European Commissioner, says, okay, so we're going to have a thin equivalence deal. We're going to have data adequacy that's going to be open to challenge by data activists in the court, etc. What do you do? Do you just wait for 3 or 4 years, he asks, or what do you do to try and bridge that period, which is clearly going to be difficult for all the reasons you've so elegantly enumerated?
Well, I think, look, I mean, what do you do? I mean, I'm not one of the actors. So the question is, do we want to do something, and do we want to do something about it? And am I wrong fundamentally to think that we don't really want close and amicable relations over the next few years? I hope I'm wrong, obviously, but my instinct from everything I hear from very good sources in Whitehall is that that isn't really where we are. There are loads of things you could do. We're talking about COP26. Where are we on, carbon border adjustment mechanisms? Where are we on emissions trading schemes? Where are we on carbon taxation? Where are we on net zero? Is there loads of stuff that you could be doing with the European Union and in close collaboration with the European Union on that kind of agenda? Yes, and I would hope technocratically we will, and we certainly should. I've got a slight doubt about whether politically we will want to do that very visibly. Then what could you do in the next 3 to 4 years? One, you could have a much better and more trusting advance warning mechanism process. If you're, I think of what Lindsay Appleby might have to do and want to do in this relationship, walking in as he has to the environment he's walked into. Look, there are going to be bumps, there are going to be conflicts, there are going to be trade disputes. We shouldn't be alarmed about that. That's inevitable. There is going to be a certain degree of name calling. There are going to be some surprises, and there are going to be some unpleasant surprises, and no doubt some deliberately unpleasant surprises on both sides. There are ways of, adding depth and ballast to that relationship which make you able to navigate those. And the question there is, how much do we put into the Partnership Council? How much of this can be done by political means? If you overload the dispute resolution mechanism, or mechanisms, because they're complex mechanisms in this TCA, and we'll see how the rebalancing part works. And we'll see how those panels, which have to convene at great speed and produce results on things which might be extremely conflictual, if you overload those dispute resolution mechanisms early on with multiple different disputes which get poisonous between us and Paris and Berlin in particular, then the whole thing may fall apart. So I put a big premium, and this is where the Frost role will be extremely important, on what's the political management of this process to prevent the overloading of the boat and to make sure that on those things that can be managed, and where actually there's a large degree of common ground, there's the political appetite to do that.
Do you see those committees, Ivan, do you see those committees being very active? Am I going to be reporting about them in the news? Are they going to be driving the news agenda? Are they going to be sort of forums for funnels for the new EU-UK relationship?
Look, this is where you don't know if you're not in the room, and I can't possibly judge, but I've heard plenty of people who were in the room, and my sense is that the governance architecture was very uncomfortable for the British side, and we've ended up with a panoply of technocratic committees of the classic European sort that I suspect David didn't really want. Now, he can then, try and subvert those over the next few weeks and months and ensure they don't meet that often and there isn't too much substance in them, and that's not how we want to govern this process, and we don't want to be sucked into some ghastly quasi-European comitology process. He can say that, and he won't do that. Well, you can no doubt police that and ensure it doesn't happen. Now, I think that would be a mistake. Equally, we shouldn't kid ourselves that entirely technocratic processes on each of those subcommittees is going to be enough, because it's politics. And where those things surface from the technocratic level and become real political flashpoints, what's the process to prevent those flashpoints getting out of control? I mean, let's think back to a sort of very distant period, as you say. When I worked for kind of Leon Britain, and we had just concluded the last ever multilateral round to be concluded, which is now 26, 27 years ago. Multilateralism has not succeeded very much in the Doha round. We had a whole series of flashpoints, mostly on things ranging from bananas to beef hormones to Helms-Burton on Cuba to D'Amato legislation on Iran, and it started to get heavily out of control on the EU-US relationship, which, as you can imagine from Leon's point of view, as a profound kind of Atlanticist and free trader, he didn't want. But it got very spiky, very difficult, very conflictual, and the only things that came up in conversation between the EU and US started to become the conflicts. Now, this isn't obviously a direct analogy, but there are similarities in the kind of EU-US relationship and the EU-UK relationship. If you end up with the EU-UK relationship being defined solely by its disputes, you're in trouble. So you do have to put serious political substance into the things that we want to do together. And you do have to put serious political substance into the conversations. If, for example, on China or on Russia, we think that the European Union is in danger of going the wrong way on the Hong Kong question or the Uyghurs question or whatever, what is the government going to do? Is it simply going to think, well, I approach this issue with Paris and Berlin and we cut out the European Union because they're part of the problem? I think that would be a mistake. You are going to have serious substantive discussions through EU institutions, through EU fora. And you're going to have to put enough constructive agendas on the table, because it's only when you've got enough constructive material to discuss that people can then say, yeah, but the beef hormones thing I think of, it's still running between the EU and US. It broke out in my first month in the job, which is now 25 years ago. It hasn't been settled, but it hasn't destabilized the entire bloody relationship to the point where it falls over. And that's what we're going to have to do over the next couple of years.
So the first big flashpoint so far has been Northern Ireland. A deal that put a trade border in the Irish Sea that Boris Johnson has been constantly in denial of, but nonetheless a deal that was, I think, destabilised by an extraordinary mistake by the European Commission in threatening to trigger Article 16 that would effectively put some kind of border back north-south in order to control vaccine exports. And yes, the Commission apologised for that very quickly, but the fact that they made that decision really begs the question about whether or not they understand that the Northern Ireland border is not the Dover-Calais border, that actually this protocol is fragile. Anton Spisak, who used to be a UK negotiator now with the Tony Blair Institute, says, do you think the Northern Ireland Protocol can be maintained without cross-community support beyond the 2024 vote, which is the first of the 4 yearly votes on consent? Do you think it can be survived, or is it just going to be fundamentally undermined by a lack of unionist support?
I think it's a very good question, and I'm not at all sure it can. I think it should. I think it's going to require a huge amount of care and attention from both sides. I thought the Commission's action, as you say, they fortunately stopped themselves doing it, but I mean, a lot of damage had been done, were quite astonishingly bad, and a very bad sign about their level of understanding of what they were dealing with. You have to assume that Michel Barnier would not have made that mistake, but it's a very alarming sign that the 13th floor in the Berlaymont is capable of thinking that and not checking themselves. So it tells you a lot. Will it survive? As I say, I think it has to survive, or we're all in deep trouble, and that brings deeper trouble to the Good Friday Agreement, Anglo-Irish relations, and plenty else. It will only survive if the Commission and the Council think pretty deeply about what's specific and what's sui generis about this position and what are they prepared to do. Now, I can understand from their perspective the irritation that, they've had Johnson congratulating himself on what a wonderful and unprecedented deal this is. You've had then Gove celebrating in December that, he'd got even greater improvements on the implementation of the deal. And this was all 8 weeks ago. So I can understand the frustrations. There are frustrations as well with, how does one put it, the naivety, say, of some in the DUP who thought that their best friends and colleagues were in the European Research Group and campaigned for the hardest possible Brexit, and now find that they're in a position where if the UK goes for more divergence and a harder Brexit over time, the border in the Irish Sea will get progressively worse for them. And they're on the wrong side of the divide, and therefore their incentives become to pull the whole thing down. So I can understand the kind of irritation and frustration on the kind of Brussels side. This is, though, where you need really intensive diplomacy amongst people who trust each other, know each other, recognise what each other is dealing with and grappling with in good faith. And that needs a kind of intensity of process, and it's got to be a political process and not just a technocratic process. Those are quite big ifs, I think. You know, I mean, this is a big responsibility for both Šefčovič and Frost. It's got off to a very bad start. That has undoubtedly made the situation in Northern Ireland more febrile and more fragile. And once these things start to go wrong in Northern Ireland, as you say, it's not remotely like Dover-Calais or indeed any other enclave elsewhere in the European Union is used to dealing with. So it's a pretty bad start. I think it's salvageable, but I think it's really in peril. And I think over the next 2 to 3 months, there may be still more pressures on the unionist side, including on the kind of more radical unionist forces now emerging, to say, let's just junk the thing. And trying to pressurise Johnson into triggering Article 16 with a slightly weird understanding of what Article 16 actually does or actually is. But you know, so there's a high risk, I think, and
does the EU
requires kind of political and not just technocratic process.
Yes, I mean, if we haven't yet diverged radically, the risk to the single market remains there in principle, but in practice is quite low. There have been grace periods that were built in before everyone needed export health certificates and the full panoply of checks going in from goods going from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. Would it be the responsible thing for the EU to put aside their irritation with the way perhaps that the Brits milked their mistake over Article 16 and actually grant some of those derogations that Michael Gove asked Maroš Šefčovič for in his letter, just in order to settle this thing down?
Well, look, I'm not close enough to it to know exactly kind of what you would come up with and what you would try and do. I would have thought that you could have an intensive process with the Commission and with the key council people on this and get somewhere on it, despite the kind of legal theology. I think some of the biggest problems may be with some of the key member states, without naming names. So I think maybe more.
Ivan, that's a good point, isn't it? Do the member states, are they using the protocol, as it were, as a test of good faith for the rest of the relationship?
Yeah, and I think the internal market bill shenanigans and what we saw in September didn't help, did it? And people also, I'm afraid, associate that with David Frost because they think it was his idea and he pushed it through and not everybody in the government was on board for it. So I'm afraid that then adds to the kind of residue of distrust. So yes, I think they do, but I've often thought in this business, and often thought when I was in this business in Brussels, that people in London think the hardest line people are the apparatchiks and the theologians and the lawyers in Brussels. And actually, sometimes it's the member states driving a harder line position than some in the Commission. You have to work very hard at both ends, but I think some of the capitals here may be a bigger problem for London than some in the Commission. But with the Commission, you're going to have to work very hard politically, not just through Šefčovič, but through others, but primarily through him, obviously with the President of the Commission. But you're also going to have to work technically and then give Commission officials, huge assurances about what can be done to mitigate the kinds of concerns they will have, some of which will be overblown. Of course, they're overblown, technocratic concerns. And you would have thought those could be addressed over time. But some of them will be legitimate concerns about, diversion through the Irish border.
It's a difficult and really fragile thing. Listen, our time is short. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I didn't want to finish without asking you about the states and the Biden administration. Michael Dettar, who's a retired US State Department official, has a question, and he says, if the Biden administration's priority is to rebuild relations with the EU and not conclude new trade agreements, where does that leave UK-US relations? And how does Johnson, and this is me, not him, but how does Johnson play that game, do you think? It was interesting that I think von der Leyen was quite far down the Biden call sheet from what one reads. But how is that going to play? And are we going to do this trade deal with the States? And obviously that's going to toughen that Irish Sea border and toughen the Dover-Calais border potentially as well.
Well, I would assume so, and I think it remains a strategic priority for the government to try and do a trade deal with the States. As I said, if they think the European Union is a difficult negotiating partner, try negotiating with the USTR, with the White House behind them, and with the Congress making the kinds of demands I know it will make. I assume David Frost, amongst others, and Liz Truss will know that very well, but if they don't, they're going to find out. They're very tough bastard negotiators. Will the US attach any importance to this over the next couple of years? Seems unlikely. On the other hand, if you could do a deal with the UK which sets some benchmarks which might be quite uncomfortable for the European Union on certain things the US cares about, why not do it? And the UK will probably be a more pliable partner. Let's be honest, the UK is easier to push over on these things. It will want a deal geostrategically, and therefore I think the American administration will think that it can get economic substance out of the UK to get a deal, because the political prize of getting a deal is important. SPS will be very, very difficult with the US and create complications for the relationship. I assume part of the thinking that the UK has about joining CPTPP first, rather than getting in there first rather than with the Americans, maybe to ease the passage of things that they might want to do anyway for the benefit of the Americans. Look, the relationship. Johnson has big opportunities this year via the G7, which he chairs. And, it seems to me on the pandemic, on health generally, and on the preparation of COP26, has big opportunities. I think there's stuff that he'll want to do around digital agenda as well, and, data issues. It seems to me he'll want quite an ambitious G7 agenda where he will need American buy-in and support. He'll want a very good COP26. I mean, the joke obviously about all COPs is they're always a tremendous success for whichever presidency happens to be running them. But he does need a success, and you have an opportunity here with an American administration that's back at the table and is serious on these issues. And, he's putting John Kerry in, so there will be American heft at the table and a determination to do things. There's some very interesting questions about what the Brits do with the Chinese and what generally can be done with the Indians on that question. So I think Johnson will be extremely pragmatic, and I think Biden will be extremely pragmatic. Biden's private views on the wisdom or otherwise of the UK leaving the EU, I think, are neither here nor there. He will care about Good Friday Agreement and the Irish border issue. I think they will view the UK as a kind of reliable and dependable NATO and Five Eyes partner and will want to do business. I think they'll be wary of trilateralizing. I know there are some ideas around of, EU, UK, US trilateralism. I suspect that will make the EU extremely uneasy. I think it would make the US uneasy. So I doubt we'll have too many of those kind of sessions or fora where the US try and bring an external non-EU actor into the room. I think this administration, it's not Europhile to the point of being naive, but it does know its way around the European Union far more than the Trump administration, and it's not anti-European. It may have huge doubts about the capability of the European Union to do stuff and to address stuff that really matters to the Americans, but I think it'll try much harder through both Paris and Berlin. Brussels is always really quite difficult, even with somebody as good as Tony Gardner, my old opposite number, is always quite difficult for the US to navigate and the institutions and for US politicians to understand. But I think they'll try harder to move with both Berlin and Paris, recognizing though that there are still some pretty fundamental divides between European and American perceptions of the world, not just on the China question.
No, indeed. If we had more time, we would explore how Boris Johnson might exploit that deal. But we don't, Ivan. We're out of time. Thank you so much for your time, and to Paul Adamson for setting up this forum. We've talked over some pretty tough things, and clearly this is going to be an evolving and difficult relationship. And the more talking that happens, I would say this as a journalist, the better. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks everyone for your brilliant questions and for tuning in. And I know you'll look forward to the next EU UK Forum event.
Thanks very much.